Good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of interesting stuff to talk about this morning. So first of all, a blockbuster report. Now, this is being disputed, but we'll get into all of it about who actually blew up the Nord Stream pipeline and how precisely they did it. You definitely want to hear the details there. We also have the highlights and lowlights from the Twitter hearings yesterday from both sides. New AI wars reaching new heights, I guess. You've got Microsoft and Google kind of going at it. Very interesting in terms of the future and big implications here for, I think, the news media and what it's going to mean for online news in particular. We have Donald Trump accusing Ron DeSantis of being a groomer. DeSantis now firing back as the Republican primary continues to heat up. And quite an extraordinary reaction to the Biden State of the Union coming from a former Democratic member of Congress. We'll play that for you, too. Also excited to welcome to the show Trevor Aronson. He has a new podcast out. Blockbuster reporting about how the FBI infiltrated Black Lives Matter protests in Denver in particular. And the allegation here is that they basically tried to make this thing more violent in an attempt to entrap people, sort of echoes of COINTELPRO here. So Trevor's going to come on. He's going to tell us all about his reporting. But first, we wanted to start with some big news with regards to the Ukraine war.
Yeah, that's right. So President Zelensky leaving Ukraine and traveling to the United Kingdom. This morning, he's actually in France. So yesterday in the UK, he made an impassioned speech at Westminster for fighter pilots for fighter jets to be delivered to Ukraine from the UK, and they are open to that possibility. Here's what he had to say.
I will explain. It's the helmet of a real Ukrainian pilot. He is one of our most successful aces, and he's one of our kings. And the writing on the helmet reads, "We have freedom, give us wings to protect it."
So that was President Zelensky at Westminster. It was a big speech in the UK. He was greeted on the tarmac by Rishi Sunak. And according to the UK press and some leaks out of the UK government, they are highly considering actually turning over F-16s. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. So what we do know is that the Prime Minister said that Ukrainian pilots, as a, quote, first step, will begin their months-long training on NATO standard aircraft. Now, they're going to be trained. That doesn't necessarily mean that the jets are going yet. However, they said that all options were on the table. The defense secretary has now been tasked with investigating which jets that the UK might be able to supply to Ukraine. So the prime minister just said it would be a, quote, long-term option. So this, of course, has been probably behind the tanks, which they just got, British Challenger tanks, Leopard tanks from the US, from Germany, and from elsewhere. This has probably been the top ask of the Zelensky government outside of a no-fly zone. It was totally off the table for basically the entire year. But, you know, as I often say, on a long enough timeline, they do appear to get whatever they want. The other question, too, is about how the rest of the NATO countries will react. So France, of course, has its own jets. The U.S. has jets. President Biden shot down that report about the Pentagon, saying that they were warming to providing jets to Ukraine. He was said point blank, no, we're not going to send F-16s. However, some of the wording here of what we're looking at is NATO standard aircraft, F-16 not being specifically named, so another aircraft could be sending there. But of course, you know, it would be an extraordinary move. It would be effectively the most escalatory piece of weaponry that we could provide the Ukrainians, literally outside of a direct no-fly zone and intervention into the conflict, Krystal.
Yeah, and it's worth keeping in mind with regards to how we ended up agreeing to sending tanks, that there was resistance, especially actually coming from the Pentagon, right up until the moment when they decided, they ultimately caved and said, all right, fine, we're going to send the tanks. And part of how that all happened is there was a lot of pressure coming from Germany because Germany was under pressure to send tanks and they didn't want to be out there alone. So effectively, they sort of pressured the U.S. and ultimately, because we seem to always do this, we caved and said, all right, fine, we will send the tanks. So are you going to have a similar dynamic here where the UK is on board with sending fighter jets, but wants us to go along with them? You know, the UK, whether it is under new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak or previous Prime Minister, this was now 2 Prime Ministers ago, Boris Johnson, They have been among the most bellicose, the most hawkish, the most pro-escalation. Famously, Boris Johnson, flew to Kyiv early on in the conflict and delivered the message probably on behalf of the U.S. that even though peace talks were sort of moving forward and they were coming close to potentially some sort of deal, that the U.S. and the U.K. did not want a deal at that time. So they have been our close partners in terms of a strategy that has just consistently led to escalation after escalation after escalation. I think it is always important to go back to the way this was sold to the American people at the beginning and what we were told were going to be the parameters of our support. The parameters of that support were going to be, we will provide whatever weapons we can for Ukraine to defend themselves, and offensive capabilities, tanks, and especially longer range missiles, and doubly especially fighter jets, totally off the table. Joe Biden says, no, we're not going to do it. He's said that before about many other things that we ultimately ended up shipping. So I wouldn't take that. I would take that with a lot of grains of salt.
We'll see. Boris Johnson, Prime Minister Johnson, a former Prime Minister Johnson, was actually here in the United States just last week campaigning to send F-16s to the Ukrainians. He's been calling for more fighter jets that go over there. I'm of a couple of minds of this. Of course, I do want the Europeans to take the vast majority of the aid. So it's one of those things where I'm like, hey, you want to send it? Then all right, that's on you. But don't get us into your mess. But in a lot of ways, it also doesn't work like that, right? Because we're all NATO allies, and if somebody attacks Britain, well, we're all in it no matter what. So I don't really know how exactly we should look at this. The real question is always going to come down to Washington. What does Washington think? What are they going to do? Are they going to join the UK? I mean, it's almost never happened that, outside of DC, that another country is willing to give something even more offensive to the Ukrainians without the US joining in part. So we'll see if Biden can keep the pressure against that inside of the Pentagon. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical of all of that.
Yeah, well, and Russia, rightly, I think, at this point, sees this as a proxy war with the U.S. specifically and NATO more broadly. Right. Are they going to make a crucial distinction between whether it's the Brits or us that send the fighter jets? I highly doubt it.
Right. So Christopher Caldwell had actually a great op-ed in the New York Times. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. I thought we would read some of it to all of you because he did a very good job of articulating it. So Russia and Ukraine have incentives to negotiate. The U.S. has other plans. That's the headline. So what he reads here is that the United States' recent promise to ship M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine was swift response to a serious problem. The problem is that Ukraine is losing the war, not as far as we can tell because its soldiers are fighting poorly or its people have lost heart, but because war has settled into a World War I style battle of attrition, complete with carefully dug trenches and relatively stable fronts. Such wars tend to be won, as World War I was, by the side with the demographic and industrial resources to hold out the longest. Russia has 3 times Ukraine's population, an intact economy, superior military technology. At the same time, Russia has its own problems. Until recently, a shortage of soldiers, vulnerability of arms depots to missile strikes slowed its westward progress. Both sides thus have an incentive to come to the negotiating table. The Biden administration has other plans. It is betting that by providing tanks, it can improve Ukraine's chances of winning the war. In a sense, the idea is to fast forward history from World War I battles of position to World War II battles of movement. It's a plausible strategy. 80 years ago, the tanks of Hitler and Stalin revolutionized warfare not far from the territory that is being fought today. But the Biden strategy has a bad name: escalation. Beyond a certain point, the United States is no longer, quote, helping or, quote, advising or, quote, supplying the Ukrainians the way that it did, say, the Afghan Mujahideen. It is, quote, replacing Ukraine as Russia's main battlefield adversary. It is hard to say when that point will be reached or whether it has been already. With whom is Russia at war, Ukraine or the United States? Russia started the war between Russia and Ukraine. Who started the war between Russia and the United States? This sudden policy lurch has the look of an accident, and he talks about the way that the tanks were ultimately shipped because of the Germans and what they were asking of us. But ultimately, what he comes down to and what he points is that where that line is as to when we are replacing Ukrainian forces as opposed to supporting Ukrainian forces, well, it's a complicated question. It's one of those, like the famous quote about pornography from the Supreme Court. It's like, I know it when you see it. To me, tanks and jets look very close to the replacement line. I probably could have made a good case basically all the way back to the beginning. But the point that he's making is that, look, I mean, Ukraine is a polity that does not exist without the West, period. They'll literally fold tomorrow. So they have no industrial base. They have no economy. Their entire population is already weaponized towards total warfare. And that's just simply not going to cut it in an actual conflict. Now, with the help of their allies, they're able to hold on. The question, though, and you use the word defense. I already know the Ukraine stands will say, well, they're defending their territory. They were invaded. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And again, I've said this. I would do the exact same thing if I were them. The question to us, though, is like, well, where's our line? Are we willing to go to war and let Ukrainian jets bomb Crimea? I mean, or sorry, U.S. provided jets to bomb Crimea? That's a whole other ballgame in terms of the way that they consider it. Bombing eastern Ukraine is a whole other scenario. And the Ukrainians, by the way, all the polling coming out of Ukraine in the at least western part of Ukraine, the people who massively support the Zelensky government, 91% of them want to retake Crimea. They look at it as a total non-negotiable thing that we would tell them not to do it. Listen, you can do what you want. What you do with our weapons, though, we're going to have some say in that. And I think we probably should.
There's a couple of really key points that he makes here. As you lay out, Saagar, targeting Crimea is a different thing, a different beast. And what he says in this piece is President Biden's own advisors are divided on how aggressively to pursue the war. Some even proposed to chase Russia out of Crimea. That would promise a new kind of mission for NATO, the conquest, annexation, and garrisoning of a population that doesn't want it. So with regards to Crimea, I think he lays that out extremely well. The other piece here is that, he reminds that we have to keep in mind not just what's good for us or good for Ukraine in the short term, but how are you going to bring this thing to a close? And when or if is Russia likely to fold? Like, you have to get into their shoes and how they're looking at this as well. And he warns we should not forget that whatever values each side might bring to it, this war is not at heart a clash of values. It is a classic interstate war over territory and power, occurring at a border between empires. In this confrontation, Mr. Putin and his Russia have fewer good options for backing down than American policymakers seem to realize, and more incentives to follow the U.S. all the way up the ladder of escalation. That is a dire warning right there, because what does the ladder of escalation look like when you're talking about two nuclear-armed superpowers? I don't think that is a place that any of us want to go and that our policymakers should be ultimately pushing us. So I think he lays out the stakes here quite well and has some clear thinking about what we're doing, how we have just sort of climbed this ladder of escalation with very little debate, with very little thinking, and where this could ultimately all lead.
Yeah, well, I think we'll all find out. And look, things on the ground are actually shifting quickly. Let's put this up there on the screen. Right now, it looks like a offensive sometime in this month of February is going to be mounted by the Russians somewhere in eastern Ukraine. A lot of intelligence coming out, spy satellites and others indicating that there's a lot of railway activity and a lot of troops that are being brought to the front line. And so this will also be a critical test of Ukrainian forces after they had their significant victory in the spring offensive, and to how they've held up through the winter. There's been relentless amounts of shelling, missile attacks all across the city. Their resolve doesn't seem to be folding. But look, you think Zelensky leaves Ukraine begging for weapons, just because it's out of the goodness of his heart or because things are going well? No, like, he's doing it because he desperately, obviously looks like he needs it in order to get the job done the way that he sees it. That's part of why he came to Washington. That's part of why he's in Paris today. And it's part of why he was in the UK, and he's probably going to go to Berlin next. And that's not a surprise to anybody.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Saagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.